My name is Iris Ashford, and I'm 39 years old. For 14 years, my family believed I filed paperwork in the basement of a courthouse somewhere. Then on a Saturday morning in October, my mom grabbed my shoulders in her kitchen and told me to confess to a felony my sister committed. A man was lying in the ICU with a shattered hip. My sister had been driving my car. My dad did the math out loud the way he does everything. "She has a campaign," he said. "You have nothing to lose." My sister didn't even look up from her phone. She just smiled and asked who'd believe me anyway. They had a lawyer sitting at the kitchen island before anyone asked me a single question. And they were so sure of the answer that they had already typed my confession. What none of them knew about my job, about what my car had been recording, about the woman who was awake and waiting when my sister came home that night, took this family apart piece by piece over the next 7 weeks. Welcome back to Last Laugh Stories, where quiet people finally tell the stories their families spent years making sure nobody heard. If you've ever been the one your family underestimated, stay with me, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. I drove 6 hours to Howard County because a 13-year-old asked me to. My niece Emma texted me in September. She said her grandpa was turning 68 and please come. And she put a heart at the end of it, and that was enough. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years. The house looked the same, which is its own kind of insult. White columns my father can't afford and never stopped paying for a banner over the porch that said Ashford for State Senate in the same blue as my sister's eyes. And snorts inside the front hall. There's a wooden bowl on the side table, and every set of car keys in the family goes in it the second you walk through the door. My mother started that when I was 7. She called it hospitality. It's really inventory. I put my keys in the bowl like everyone else. In the living room, there's a wall of framed photographs, and I'm in 9 of them. And the newest one is from a graduation that happened 14 years ago. After that, the wall just goes on without me. Nobody planned that. That's the part people don't understand. Nobody sat down and voted me off the wall. My father found me by the punch bowl and introduced me to a county commissioner and a man who owns 4 car washes. "This is our oldest." He said she does something with filing at a courthouse. The commissioner nodded politely. I shook his hand and said it was nice to meet him. And I let it stand because I always let it stand. I'd been letting it stand so long. It had stopped feeling like a decision. Being invisible was the one thing this family ever let me be good at, and I had gotten very, very good at it. By 11, the party had thinned down to the people who don't leave. My sister Colleen was still going, still on the way she's been on since she was 16. She has a face that knows where the camera is, even when there isn't one. She'd had wine, not a lot by her standards, which is its own sentence. Somebody remembered the yard signs were still in the storage barn out past the tree. And my mother said it could wait until morning. And Colleen said it absolutely could not, because a volunteer was coming at 7, and it would look disorganized. That's the word she used. Disorganized. I said goodnight and went up to the guest room, which is the second door on the left at the top of the stairs. The one with my old twin bed and a closet full of my mother's winter coats. I heard the front hall from up there. You always do. I heard the keys shift in the bowl, that flat wooden rattle, and I heard the storm door. And I thought about nothing at all. I read for a while. At about 5 to midnight, I heard the garage door come up and go back down, and then 2 voices in the kitchen. Low, the way people talk when they're trying not to wake somebody. It didn't sound like an argument. It sounded like arranging. I fell asleep. When I came down for water sometime after 1, the bowl in the front hall was empty. Not one set of keys in it, in a house with 4 cars in the driveway. I noticed it the way you notice a picture hanging crooked. And then I went back upstairs, and I didn't think about it again for 2 more days. I should have. The local news at 7 came on while I was making coffee. A man had been struck on Route 9 near the Co. up just before midnight and left there. He was 61. He was in critical condition at Mercy Regional. Witnesses had seen a dark SUV heading east and part of a plate. The anchor moved on to a high school football score. I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand and felt the house change temperature around me. My father had been in his study with the door shut since 6, which never happens on a Saturday. And I could hear him on the phone using the voice he saves for people who owe him something. Colleen didn't come down. My mother said she had a migraine. Then I went out to the driveway for my bag and found my mother already out there in a cardigan over her nightgown, wiping the inside edge of the garage door frame with a dish towel. At 7:15 in the morning, she smiled at me and said, "The pollen this year was unbelievable." My SUV was parked at the end of the row, and it was not where I'd left it. I'd backed in the way I always do. It was nose in. I walked around to the front of it. The right headlight housing had a crack running through it, like a dropped windshield. And there was a scrape of something pale along the bumper, and the whole panel was clean. Not clean like a car. Clean like somebody had gone at it with a rag. I stood there with my hand on the hood, and my mother came up the driveway behind me, and she didn't ask what I was looking at. She just said, "Come inside, Iris." Family meeting. Dale Whitfield was already at the kitchen island. He's been my father's lawyer since before I could drive. And he taught me to cast a line off the dock at Kettle Lake when I was 9. And he had a legal pad in front of him and a cup of my mother's coffee. And he'd been there long enough to finish it. That was the first thing that told me what kind of morning this was. They didn't call a lawyer after they talked to me. They called a lawyer instead of talking to me. My father came in and sat and did not say good morning. They started talking, and I want you to understand how they talked because it's the whole thing. Nobody said, "Is he going to live?" Nobody said his name. They said exposure. They said the next 72 hours. They said, "If this gets a narrative before we give it one." Dale said the phrase manageable outcome twice. My mother poured more coffee. And underneath all of it in pieces, the actual facts assembled themselves in front of me like furniture coming out of a box. Colleen had taken keys out of the bowl at 11:30. Colleen had taken my SUV because it was the last one in and nothing was blocking it. Colleen had been drinking since 400 in the afternoon. Colleen had come back at 5 to midnight with a cracked headlight and had not called anyone, and my mother had made her a cup of tea. Nobody had called a 9911. Nobody had driven back out to Route 9. A man had lain in a ditch beside his bicycle for 19 minutes before a truck driver found him. His snorts, then Dale slid a sheet of paper across the granite, turned so it faced me, already typed, already dated. It was a confession. Mine. I read it twice. It said I had borrowed the vehicle, that I had been unfamiliar with the road, that I had panicked. Somebody had put the word panicked in my mouth at 600 in the morning. My mother came around the island and took hold of both my shoulders, and she looked at me with more warmth than she'd shown me in 3 years, and she said it plainly, like she was helping. "Just say you were driving." I asked her if she understood what she was asking. She said she understood exactly, and that's why it had to be me. No husband, no children, no campaign, a job nobody could name. My father didn't get up. He looked at me across the counter with his reading glasses pushed up, and he laid it out the way he'd lay out a budget line. "She has a campaign," he said. "You have nothing to lose." And there it was, the whole family ledger in one sentence, said out loud in front of a lawyer. And not one person at that island flinched. Colleen came in then in a sweatshirt, hair up, no makeup, and she poured herself orange juice while I told them no. I said it once evenly, and then I said it again, because the first one didn't seem to register. Dale said we should all take a breath. My father said we didn't have time to take a breath, and in snorts my sister leaned back against the counter with the glass in her hand and looked at me the way you look at a dog doing a trick badly. And she wasn't even angry, which was worse. She said, "Who'd believe you anyway?" I picked up my coat off the back of the chair. I got as far as the doorway. And then my father said one more thing, and it stopped me with my hand on the frame. Colleen already gave her statement. He said, "This morning at 7, Your name is in it." I turned around. Dale wouldn't look at me, which is how I knew it was true, and how I knew he'd helped write it. She'd told an investigator that her sister was visiting from out of state, that her sister had asked about the highway on ramp, that her sister had gone out around 11:30. Not an accusation. Better than an accusation, a helpful detail from a cooperative family. I stood in that doorway and did the arithmetic they were certain I couldn't do. The vehicle is registered to me. The witnesses saw a dark SUV and half a plate. I was asleep, alone in a guest room with no one to say otherwise. And the first person to hand police a story owns the shape of the story. Everyone who comes after is just disagreeing with it. My father was watching me work it out, and he thought what he saw on my face was fear. It wasn't. It was recognition. I had spent 8 years as a public defender, standing next to people who got convicted of things they didn't do. And almost none of them lost because of evidence. They lost because somebody got there first. I put my coat back on the chair, not because they'd won. Because leaving Howard County that morning would have been the single most useful thing I could have done for them. The out-of-state sister who came for one night and fled. They knew a version of me that was 14 years out of date, and they'd never once bothered to check whether it had been revised. That was their first mistake. It was not going to be the expensive one. I should tell you what happened when I was 25 because it's the whole foundation of the house. I failed the bar exam the first time I took it. 40% of my class failed that year. It's a footnote in most lives. It happened in July, and my father was 6 weeks out from a re-election, and a man running for county commissioner needs a story that makes him human. So at a fundraiser at the Elks Lodge in front of 200 people who buy gravel and sell insurance, he told them his oldest had gone off to law school and washed out. And he shrugged and said, "You can't win them all." And the room laughed, and he got the warmth he needed. My mother was standing next to him. Afterward, in the parking lot, I asked her how she could let him say that. She fixed my collar. She was gentle about it, which is what I remember most. She said, "We don't have truths in this family, sweetheart. We have versions." I passed the bar in February. I never told them. I left to Howard County and took a public defender job 400 miles away. And I learned something in my first year that I mistook for wisdom for the next 14. If you don't tell people anything, they can't take anything. So, I stopped telling them things. I stopped correcting the filing clerk joke. I stopped sending news. When I was sworn in years later, I stood in a robing room and buttoned the collar myself alone, because I hadn't invited a single person who shared my last name. I told myself the silence was dignity. It took a man bleeding in a ditch on Route 9 to show me what it actually was. By Sunday afternoon, the state police had taken the case over from the county because Walter Boone had gone from critical to still critical, and the charge was going to be a felony either way. A detective, Dana Pitt, called the house and said she'd be scheduling interviews with everyone who'd been at the residence Friday night. Snorts. My father took that call in the hallway with his hand over the receiver. Then Dale came back at 4 with a cleaner draft of my statement. The word panicked was gone, replaced with became disoriented, and he set it on the coffee table and said there was no rush. And then he said the county attorney's office would want something by a week from Thursday, which is a rush. That's how it works. Somebody tells you there's no pressure and then hands you a deadline in the same breath, and you're supposed to hear the first part. I went out to the porch and called a woman named Renee O'Caffer, who I'd sat across from in a courtroom 9 years earlier and had never forgotten, and I told her everything in about 4 minutes. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether I'd said anything to any investigator. I hadn't. She asked whether I'd touched my vehicle. I said, "Only the hood." She said, "Good." And then she said, "Don't touch it again. And don't be alone with any of them. And I'll be there Tuesday." I sat on that porch after we hung up and looked at my SUV at the end of the driveway with the cracked headlight. There was one thing in that car none of them knew existed. It had been recording since the moment somebody turned the key. And the whole problem for the next 5 weeks was that I couldn't just go take it. People think a modern car is a car. It isn't. It's a witness that never blinks and doesn't care who pays for it. Mine is a 2023, and it does 3 things nobody thinks about when they buy one. It keys the driver profile to the fob. So the seat and the mirrors move to whoever's holding it. It pairs to a phone automatically, and it writes that down. And it has an event data recorder that wakes up when the airbag sensors feel a hard enough impact and saves the 5 seconds on either side of it. Speed brake, throttle, steering angle. I sat in the passenger seat Monday morning with the door open and 1 foot on the driveway, and I turned the screen on and did not touch anything else. The driver profile was set to guest. The seat was 4 in forward of where I keep it. And under the phone menu in the list of paired devices, there was one that hadn't been there Friday morning. Colleen's iPhone connected at 11:31 at night, disconnected at 11:57. I looked at that for a long moment, and then I turned the screen off and got out and closed the door and did not take one single thing out of that vehicle. And I want to be clear about why, because it's the most important decision in this entire story. I'm a federal judge. I have thrown out evidence for less. If I pulled that data myself out of my own, car as the person they were about to accuse, every hour of it becomes a question about me. At breakfast, Dale mentioned that the family would take care of getting the headlight fixed. There was a body shop in Delort that could take it Wednesday. I said that was thoughtful of him. Then I went upstairs and called my insurance company. I told them in the flattest, customer service voice I own that my vehicle may have been involved in an incident while in the possession of another driver, that liability was unclear, and that I wanted a claim opened and the vehicle preserved in its current condition pending investigation. It took 11 minutes. The adjuster put a hold on the vehicle before lunch. No shop in 3 counties will touch a car with an open claim and a preservation hold on it, because they don't get paid and they do get sued. Nobody had to be told no. There was simply from Monday afternoon onward no way to fix that headlight, and no way to vacuum that interior, and no way to make that seat go back 4 inches. It was the most boring thing I did all month. My father found out Tuesday because the body shop called Dale to cancel. He didn't say anything about it at dinner. He passed me the green beans and asked about the drive up Lee, and he looked at me for about a second, and a half longer than a person looks at their daughter. I've spent my whole career watching people recalculate at counsel table. You can see it happen. Something they had filed under settled quietly moves into the open column. Hekin Snorts was starting to wonder whether the daughter he'd written off in a parking lot 14 years ago was actually the person standing in his kitchen. He didn't ask. Asking would have required believing there was something worth knowing. My mother refilled his water and said the beans were from the farmer's market, and everybody agreed that they were good. On Wednesday, I drove to Mercy Regional and sat in the surgical ICU waiting room for 2 hours in the corner. And I did not tell anyone who I was because I wasn't anyone there and had no business being anything else. Walter Boone's wife was in the chairs by the window. Her name is Sharon. She had a canvas bag with a crossword book in it that she never opened. A nurse came to update her, and Sharon did what everyone does with medical people. She tried to make him a person instead of a hip. She said he'd worked the line at the Blue Star Diner for 30 years, and he could plate 40 covers an hour, and never once got an order wrong. She said the truck needed a transmission, 1-800. And Walter had decided in August that he'd ride the bike until Christmas and put the difference away, because that's what he does. He decides things and then he just does them. She said he's got a helmet. He wears the helmet. She said that twice to the nurse. Like the helmet was an argument she needed to keep winning. And on the corkboard by the coffee machine, between a flu clinic notice and a church bulletin, somebody had pinned up one of my sister's campaign cards. Her face, that smile, the blue, and under it in white capital, letters the slogan her consultant had focus grouped in June. Accountability for Howard County. I looked at it for a while. Then I got up and put $4 in the vending machine and bought Sharon Boone a coffee she didn't ask for, and I sat it down next to her, and I left before she could ask me what my name was. Thursday morning. I went to see Dale Whitfield alone at his office above the pharmacy on Main, because there was still a version of the world in my head where a decent man had gotten swept into something and needed one honest conversation to find his footing. He has a photograph on his wall of himself and my father and 2 other men holding up a stringer of Wally at Kettle Lake in 1998. And I am in the corner of that photograph, 11 years old, holding the net. He poured me coffee in a mug that said "World's okayest golfer." I told him the whole thing, not as a suspect, not as a lawyer. I told him about the bowl, and the keys and the seat position and the timeline. And he listened the way he used to listen when I was a kid, explaining a knot, nodding along, letting me get to the end. And when I got to the end, he set his coffee down. And he said, "Sign the statement, kiddo." He said it kindly. He said the county attorney was prepared to be reasonable, that with no priors, it would be a deferred sentence, that in 18 months it would be nothing but paperwork. He said, "It's the version that saves everybody." The man who taught me to cast off a dock was quietly explaining to me why I should take a felony for my sister. And he thought he was being generous. And on the desk between us was a yellow legal pad. And clipped to the top of it was a memo slip, with a letterhead I recognized, because it had been on 100 filings I'd read in my first year of practice. The office of the Howard County Attorney Rex Calder, my father's first campaign volunteer, class of 1994. Renee Okaper had come up that Tuesday and taken a room at the Inn out by the highway. And the afternoon I got back from Dale's office, she made me say all of it out loud again while she took notes in a hand I couldn't read upside down, which I suspect is on purpose. Then she told me where I actually was, and it was worse than I'd let myself put into words. 1. The moment I pull anything out of that vehicle myself, I'm the accused party handling my own evidence, and any competent attorney turns the rest of the hearing into a conversation about my hands. 2. The ordinary door for all of this. The county attorney's office is a man who has been at my father's elbow since the before I could vote, and a file can sit in an office like that for a very long time without anyone technically doing anything wrong. 3. And she was careful with this one. I hold a federal judicial commission, which means I don't get to be clever. Not one phone call to anyone I know. Nothing said to any reporter ever. Nothing that could ever be described as a judge leaning on a case. Every ordinary advantage a person in trouble has, I had to hand back at the door. I said, "So I have the truth and no way to move it." She kept her pen. She said, "Data gets challenged all day long. Chain of custody, tampering, spoliation. She's done it herself and won." Then she said the thing I've thought about every week since. A witness under oath is a different animal, Iris. Sooner or later, this case is going to need your face. My face. The one thing I'd spent 14 years keeping out of every frame in that house. We did it on a Friday afternoon, in the parking lot of a strip mall in Delore. Because Renee wanted concrete and cameras and a business address in the record, she hired a forensic technician named Priya Raval out of the Capitol, and Priya brought her own equipment and her own paperwork and a phone on a tripod that ran the entire time. Renee narrated it for the recording like a woman reading a grocery list: date, time, location, participants, vehicle identification number, odometer. Priya photographed the headlight, the bumper, the seat rails, the odometer, the paired device list, all of it before she touched anything. Then she pulled the module and the storage card, and when she was done, she held them out to me on a flat palm, and I stood in that parking lot and held the whole night of October of the 11th in my hand for about 10 seconds. It's smaller than a key. It weighs nothing. Priya asked if I wanted to review the contents before she sealed it, and I said no. Reen's eyebrows went up a 1/4 inch, which for her is a shout. I said, "If I watch it first?" Then every answer I give from here on out is an answer I've had time to shape, And one day somebody is going to ask me under oath whether I saw it before I told my story, and I'm going to want to say no. So Priya put it in a paper evidence bag and sealed the flap with red tape and signed across the seal and dated it. And Renee signed under her, and it went into a locked case in the trunk of a rental car. I didn't know what was on it. I'd only knew what my car had been awake for. And Route 9 wasn't the only thing it remembered that night. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about a car. It's about who your family has decided you are and what happens the first time you refuse to agree with them. If you've ever been written off by the people who were supposed to know you best, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Now, let me tell you what my mother did next, because she waited until the exact right moment. And she is very, very good at this. Sunday there was a dinner, not a family meeting, a dinner with the good plates, and pot roast with the little onions, which I have loved since I was 6 and had not been served in this house in over a decade. My mother had gotten out the album, the fat green one, and it sat at the end of the table like a third course. Emma was there and was allowed to stay up. My father asked me about the district I lived in and listened to the whole answer. Colleen passed me the rolls and said she liked my haircut. It was the warmest room I had been in with these people since I was in my 20s, and every single degree of it was on purpose, and knowing that did almost nothing to protect me. After Emma went up, my mother put her hand flat on the table and made the offer. Dale had spoken to Rex, a plea to a reduced count, no jail, community service, a deferred judgment that seals in 18 months. And then she said the part she had been saving, and she said it softly, looking right at me. And you'd be part of this family again, Iris. Really part of it. Sunday dinners, Emma's birthdays, all of it. 14 years I had been standing outside that window, and my mother finally opened the door, and the price on the door was a felony and a man in a wheelchair. The terrifying thing wasn't the offer. I've been offered things by better manipulators in worse rooms. The terrifying thing was sitting at that table with the pot roast and the onions, feeling how much of me still wanted it, and understanding for the first time that they had always known exactly how much. Walter Boone woke up on the 18th. I heard it from a nurse's aide who recognized me from the waiting room and assumed I was a cousin. He'd come out of the second surgery. They'd gotten the rod in the tibia. And on the 22nd, they got him vertical for the first time. I was down the hall when they did it. 2 physical therapists, a walker, and a 61-year-old man with a hip full of hardware trying to move aft across a room. It took him 4 minutes. When he got to the chair, he made a joke I couldn't hear. And both therapists laughed, and Sharon stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. My father had told me I had nothing to lose. I sat in that hallway and counted what Walter Boone had already lost. 30 years of standing on a line for 8 hours gone. The doctors were saying he'd walk with a cane, and he'd never do a full shift again. 1-800 for a transmission he was saving toward while riding a bicycle at night in October. 19 minutes in a ditch. And in the waiting room on my way out, the television bolted up in the corner was showing my sister at a podium in front of the county building in the navy blazer, saying that her family was cooperating fully with the investigation, and that her heart was with the Boone family at this difficult time. She'd found exactly the right catch in her voice. I have watched a lot of people testify. I could not have told you it was fake. The press conference wasn't a defense, it was a frame. 2 days later, the Howard Register ran a piece about the investigation, and buried in the 11th paragraph was a sentence attributed to a source close to the family. The source said the vehicle belonged to a sister who was estranged from the family, who lives out of state, and who had been having a hard time. That's all. 3 facts, all technically true, arranged into a person, estranged out of state, having a hard time. I read it in a motel parking lot and felt something I hadn't felt since I was 25. Which is the particular vertigo of watching a version of yourself get built by people who share your last name, and knowing that The version will always travel faster than you will. That evening, Emma texted me for the first time in a month. She's 13. She wrote, "Aunt Iris, did you really do it? Nobody will tell me anything." I sat on the end of a motel bed and typed and deleted about 6 answers. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that her mother had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon and had left a man in a ditch and let her aunt's name go into a police statement, and every word of that would have been true. And I would have been doing to her exactly what her grandfather did to me at a fundraiser in 1998. So I wrote, "I did not. I promise you I'll tell you the whole thing when it's over." And I put the phone face down, because when I told that kid the truth, I wanted it to be provable, and those are 2 different things. I drove the 6 hours home on a Wednesday for one day, and it was the loneliest 24 hours of the whole thing. I went to see the circuit's ethics counsel, a small, precise man named Howard Lynn, who has an office with no windows, and I reported before anyone could discover anything, which is the only move that has ever worked in the history of this kind of trouble. I told him a member of my immediate family had implicated me in a state criminal matter, that I was likely to be a witness, and that I intended to cooperate fully. He wrote it all down. Then he gave me the rules, and they were the rules I already knew and had been hoping he'd soften. I do not identify myself by office in connection with any of it. I do not contact anyone at the county attorney's office or the state police or any court in any capacity other than as a private citizen represented by counsel. I make no public statement of any kind. If a reporter calls, I say nothing. He said, "You understand that in practice this means you will have fewer options than an ordinary person." "Not more." I said, "I did." Before I left the courthouse, I stopped in my chambers, which were dark, and stood there for a minute. The robe was on the back of the door where it always is. I have worn it for 2 years, and it has never once made me feel like the person my family thinks I am. It has only ever felt like a thing I borrowed from a serious institution and had better take care of. I locked the door and drove back to Howard County with 1 suitcase and no title at all. Whatever came next, I'd be facing it as nobody in particular, which, lucky for me, was the role this family had been training me for my entire life. Thursday came and I didn't sign. There was no scene. I sat in my mother's living room and said I would not be signing anything. And my father folded the newspaper and said, "I'll write." And that was the whole conversation. Then the house started to close one room at a time in the polite way. Friday, my mother mentioned that her sister was coming through and would need the guest room. So I moved to the Howard Inn out by the highway, which has 40 rooms and a waffle machine and a view of a grain elevator. Monday. A letter came from Dale Whitfield's office on his letterhead addressed to Renee. It said his firm represented the Ashford family. It said that any suggestion Colleen Ashford operated the vehicle was contradicted by the family's recollection. And it said in a sentence, that took me 3 readings to fully appreciate that the family would, if necessary, describe how the vehicle had been made available to another driver that evening by its owner with knowledge of the circumstances. There it is. And snorts, if I wouldn't be the driver, they'd make me the person who handed the keys to a drunk. Same felony neighborhood, softer paperwork, my name in it either way, and that afternoon, Detective Poot called my cell and asked whether I could come in Wednesday morning to the state police post in Brannigan. And then she said, in the flat way that people say things, "They've decided to say a certain way, and please bring your counsel." I hung up and sat on the end of that motel bed and understood that I had been formally moved into a category. The state police post in Brannigan is a brick building with a flag and a vending machine that only takes exact change. Renee met me in the lot. Dana Poot is about 45, and she has the specific patience of somebody who has been lied to professionally for 20 years and stopped taking it personally around year 6. She started by telling us 2 things which I did not expect, and which changed the shape of the month. The first was that 11 days earlier the state police had gone to the manufacturer directly with a warrant for the telematics on my vehicle, its own copy of the paired device log, and the crash record from the company's servers. Nothing to do with me or my hands or my sealed bag. The world had a second door, and it had been opening the whole time without asking my permission. The second was that Colleen's statement had a hole in it. She'd told them the household was quiet after 11:15, but a neighbor's the doorbell camera across the county road had caught headlights coming down the Ashford driveway at 11:29 and coming back at 11:56, and my sister had put herself upstairs for all 27 of those minutes. Then Poot asked me to walk through my night. I did. The bowl, the stairs, the book, the garage door at 5 to 12, the voices, the water, the empty bowl. No adjectives, no conclusions. When you've listened to 10 Zalozan witnesses, you learn that the honest ones are boring and the liars are vivid. At the end, she flipped back a page, stopped, and read something twice. Then she looked up at me. "One more question," she said. Occupation, I hadn't planned it. There was no moment where I decided the day. She asked a routine question off an intake sheet, and I answered it. Because you answer questions from investigators truthfully, or you don't answer them at all. And there is nothing in between that ends well. I said United States District Judge. The room went quiet. Renee looked at the table. Put did not say anything for about 4 seconds, which is a long time in a small room. And then she wrote it down. And then she asked which district, and I told her, and she wrote that down too. She had one follow-up, and it was a good one. She asked why it wasn't in the file. I said, because nobody had asked. She closed the folder and stood and walked us out through the front. And at the door, she put out her hand and said, "Thank you for coming in, Your Honor," and my mother was in the lobby. She'd driven over on her own, without telling anyone, to sit in a plastic chair by the vending machine and be helpful and available and find out what was being said about her family. She was 6 feet away. She heard all of it. I watched my mother's face do something I have seen 1,000 times from the bench and never once from her. It wasn't pride. Pride looks different. It was recalculation, the exact expression of a person moving an item out of the liabilities column and trying to work out quickly what it might be worth. She said my name once. I kept walking. In the parking lot, Renee asked if I was all right, and I stood there with my keys in my hand and said, "Who'd believe you anyway?" Well, we're about to find out. It got back to the house inside an hour. My father called me that evening and asked me to come by, and I said we could talk on the porch, and we did with the door shut behind us and the yard light on. I had spent the drive over bracing for the wrong thing. I thought he'd be angry about the concealment, or humiliated, or that somewhere in there would be one sentence about how he wished he'd known. My father was delighted. He sat down in the wickered chair and he said it was remarkable, and he said it twice and then he started working. Did I understand what this changed? A federal judge. His hands were moving now. A federal judge who takes responsibility for a tragic accident, who steps forward, who doesn't hide behind her position. He said it could be reframed inside a week. He said Rex could be brought along. He said that the story stops being a family covering for a candidate and becomes a family of public servants. And Colleen's numbers go up, not down, because voters forgive a family that owns its mistakes. He'd found a way to spend my commission. 14 years of not knowing what I did, and inside of 1 hour, he had run the appraisal. And the answer was that I was worth more as a confession with a title attached than I'd ever been worth as a daughter. I sat on the porch rail and let him finish. That was the moment I stopped hoping. Not the kitchen, not the letter, not the leak. It turns out hope is the last thing they take. And they don't even take it on purpose. They just say what they actually think out loud and then it's gone. 2 things happened that week. On Tuesday, Rex Calder gave a statement to the Register saying his office had reviewed the matter, that the evidence to date did not establish who was operating the vehicle, and that he would not be charging anyone at this time. He said the word tragedy in the phrase, grieving community, and Walter Boone was not dead, and nobody at that paper asked him about it. On Thursday, Dale filed his supplemental letter. 4 members of the Ashford family were prepared to state that I had made my vehicle available to my sister that evening with knowledge that she had been drinking. 4. My father, my mother, my sister, and because they'd needed a 4th and she was there, my Aunt Charlene, who had gone to bed at 900. Renee laid it out for me at a booth at the diner by the inn. The state police had a good file, but a state case gets prosecuted by the county attorney. And the county attorney had just publicly announced he wasn't prosecuting. And the only thing that overrides a man like Rex Calder is a record so clean and so public that not charging becomes more expensive than charging. Sworn testimony on the record from the one person in that house whose account contradicted the other 4 and who had nothing to gain by giving it. She said, "It has to be you and it has to be in the open, or it doesn't happen at all." Which is when I finally understood the shape of the last 5 weeks. There was one door left in this entire thing, and it only opened from the inside. Let me stop here for a second, because I want you to sit with the question I had to sit with that night. If telling the truth cost you your entire family, not an argument, not a bad Christmas, all of it permanently, would you still tell it? Don't answer too fast. Put it in the comments. I'll tell you in a minute what I chose and what it cost me. And if you're new here, subscribe because you're going to want to see how this ends. She came to the inn on a Sunday night, alone in an old sweatshirt with the hood down, and she'd driven her own car, and parked it around the side by the ice machine. No phone in her hand. I have never in my adult life seen my sister with nothing in her hand. I let her in, and she sat on the edge of the desk chair, and for about 10 minutes she was a person I'd never met. She talked about being 16, about the summer her friends went to a lake house, and she went to a media training in the capital because Dad had gotten her a slot through a friend, about how she learned to hold a smile for a photographer's 3rd try. She said that when she was in 9th grade, she got a C in chemistry, and our father didn't speak to her for 4 days. And she was said it the way you'd mention weather. Then she looked up and said, "Do you know what it's like to be this family's only investment?" And I did know, actually from the other side of it. She didn't apologize. That's the part I need you to hear. In that whole conversation, she never once said Walter Boone's name, never asked how he was, never said she was sorry for anything except her own position. What she'd come to do was trade. "Take the plea," she said. "You're strong enough to survive being the failure. You've been doing it for years. I'm not." For about a minute, I could see the sister I might have had if this family had been in any other business. Then she stood up to leave. And on her way past the window, she checked her reflection and touched her hair. And the campaign came back into her face like a light switching on. They set the meeting for Wednesday at 11 in the conference room above the pharmacy, and everybody came. My father in a jacket. My mother with her handbag in her lap. Colleen in the navy blazer, straight from a radio interview. Aunt Charlene and Dale at the head of the table with a folder. And inside the folder, the 3rd version of my confession. And beside it, set out square on the wood, a black fountain pen with the cap already off. I have thought a lot about that pen. He'd uncapped it before I walked in. That's a man who has never once been told no in this room. Renee sat down and opened her briefcase, and I picked the pen up. I did. I want to be honest about it. I held it and then I set it down on the table and pushed it a few inches away into snorts. I said no in a voice I didn't have to raise. Then Renee started reading. At 8:40 that morning, we had filed with the Office of the Attorney General a sworn affidavit from me describing everything I have told you. The bowl, the keys, the seat, the paired device, the garage door at 5 to midnight, the meeting at the kitchen island, the typed statement. Attached to it, a formal request for appointment of a special prosecutor on the grounds that the county attorney has the documented 32-year political relationship with a person of interest. Attached to that, a chain of custody affidavit from Priya Raval and a transfer receipt for one sealed evidence bag delivered that morning to the state police post at Brangan. My father said my name. My mother said it 3 times, in 3 different registers, all the way to the door. The sharp one, then the soft one, then the one from when I was small. I didn't turn around. 14 years I'd been the quiet daughter of the Ashford family, and she died in that doorway on a Wednesday morning. And I left her sitting at the table with the pen. That night something slid under the door of room 14. An envelope, no stamp, my mother's handwriting. There was no letter in it. There was a photograph, and it was me at 7 years old, on the front steps in a red coat holding a cat we had for 2 years. And on the back in ballpoint it said kitchen. Tomorrow 9 come alone please. She'd underlined please. So I sat at that kitchen island for the second time, in the same seat with the same coffee. And my mother told me what she had never told anyone. On the night of October 11th, she did not go to bed. She stayed up because there were still 4 people in her yard and a caterer's van in the drive. And she was in the front room at 5 to midnight when the garage door went up. She met Colleen in the kitchen. My sister's hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't get the tea out of the box. And my mother went out through the mudroom and stood in the garage and looked at the right front of my vehicle at the crack and the pale scrape. And she came back in and she took every set of keys out of the wooden bowl in the front hall and put them in her cardigan pocket. Not so no one could drive. So that at 7 the next morning when the news came on, nobody would be able to say what had been where. She'd known since 11:58 that night. She'd known when she wiped the door frame. She'd known when she poured Dale his coffee. She'd known when she came around that island and put both the hands on my shoulders and looked in my face and told me to say I was driving. I asked her why she was telling me now. She reached across and took my hand, and she was crying, and she was completely composed, and I realized she hadn't come to confess. Confession requires regret. She had come to negotiate. The hearing was the next morning at 9:30. She had 18 hours and she used every one of them well, because my mother is the best strategist in that family and always has been. And the proof is that nobody outside it has ever heard her name. She didn't threaten me. She didn't mention the 4 affidavit, or the letter, or the register. Snorts, she held my hand on the granite and she made me an offer, and it was the only offer in 14 years that ever had a chance of working. Come home, she said. Not for a dinner. Come home. Be our daughter again. Christmases, Emma's graduation, your father will put your picture back up. I'll do it myself. Everything you've wanted since you were 25, and you know it, and I know it. And then softly, almost tenderly, all you have to do is not remember quite so clearly tomorrow. She wasn't asking me to lie. She was too smart for that. And lying under oath is a thing you can be prosecuted for. She was asking me to be uncertain, to say I couldn't be sure about the time, that I'd been asleep, that it had been a long day. Nobody would ever be able to touch me for it. Walter Boone would go home with a cane and a settlement from an insurance company. My sister would be in the state senate by spring, and I would get my family back. And she finished it, the way she finishes everything with the sentence, she taught me in a parking lot when I was 25, only turned around into a gift. Pick the version where you still have a family, sweetheart. I looked at the wall past her shoulder at the photographs that stop in the year I turned 25, and I gave her my answer in one sentence, and then I drove back to the inn and slept for 6 hours, which surprised me. What I said to my mother in that kitchen was this: Mom, I've spent 14 years being the version that was convenient. Tomorrow, I'm going to be accurate. Then I said, I loved her because it was true, and because I wanted it on the record between us, and then I left. The Howard County Courthouse is a limestone building from 1911 with 9 steps and a bad handrail, and at 29 the next morning, there were 2 television cameras from the Capitol and 3 reporters at the bottom of them. They knew by then. Somebody at the register had run the appointment down. The headline that morning had the word judge in it in capital letters next to my last name. Forever. A woman put a microphone near my face and asked me if I had any comment on my sister. I said no comment. She asked if I was here in my official capacity. I said I was here as a witness. She asked one more something about the family, and I said no comment. And I went up the 9 steps and through the doors, and I did not stop, and there is no clip of me anywhere saying anything about any of it. And that was the entire strategy, and it cost me more than anything else in this story. My father had told me I had nothing to lose. He was right in a way he'd never bothered to look at closely. I had nothing they had ever counted. My name, my oath, and my spine, and I was about to spend all 3 of them in one morning. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old radiators. And in the first row on the aisle, in a wheelchair with a cane, across his lap and his wife beside him, was Walter Boone. The special prosecutor was a man named Grant Ellery, appointed 8 days earlier out of the Attorney General's office, and he had the gift of asking short questions. I was sworn at 10:15. I sat in a wooden chair in a room with a ceiling fan that clicked once every rotation, and I told it in order. The bowl in the front hall, and what my mother started at 4, the keys going in at 4 in the afternoon, the wine at the party, the yard signs in the storage barn, the stairs, the second door on the left, the rattle of the bowl, the storm door, the garage at 11:56, the voices, the empty bowl at 100 a.m., the news at 7, the dish towel, the crack in the headlight housing, and the seat 4 and forward, and the paired device that said 11:31 at night. The lawyer already sitting at the island. The typed a statement with my name on it, and the word panicked in it, which somebody later changed to became disoriented. I did not editorialize once. Priya Raval had testified before me and put the sealed bag in the record. Red tape and signature and date opened in front of the clerk. Matched line for line against the manufacturer's own telematics that the state police had pulled independently weeks before I ever handed anything to anybody. Then Colleen's attorney stood up for Cross, and he was good, and he went exactly where I would have gone. He asked how a family could possibly fail to know that their own daughter sat on a federal bench. He said it twice with the right amount of disbelief, and he turned toward the gallery when he said it, because he wanted the room to hear how absurd it was, and he was right that it was absurd. I let the fan click twice. Then I said, because I helped them not know for 14 years, I made it easy. That's my share of this counselor, and I finished paying it. He asked me to clarify, and behind him at the defense table, my sister started talking to her lawyer's back. Here is a thing I have learned from 11 years around criminal courtrooms. People who are coached for cameras are the worst witnesses alive, because a camera never interrupts you and a courtroom does nothing else. Her attorney told her to sit down. She didn't. She stood up at the defense table in the navy blazer with her hands out, palms up, the gesture she uses at the end of a stump speech, and she started to reframe. She was said this had been turned into something it wasn't. She said her sister had been out of the family for years, and there was context the court wasn't hearing. She said the word narrative out loud in a courtroom, which is a thing you can only do if you have never in your life been in one. The judge told her twice that she would have her opportunity, and on the 3rd try, she got to the end of the sentence she'd been circling for 7 weeks, and it came out of her at full volume in a room with a court reporter in it. It was one mistake, one people like her get to fail their entire lives, and it costs them nothing. I don't get even one. Nobody moved. Walter Boone looked at the floor, in the 3rd row. My mother put her hand over her mouth, and I don't know to this day whether it was for her daughter at the table or her daughter in the chair. Then the judge gave it, and it was over in the flat administrative way these things are actually over. Probable cause found. Bound over for trial. Conditions of release modified. Surrender of passport. A subpoena issued that afternoon to Marjorie Ashford regarding the location and handling of a set of vehicle keys on the night of October 11th. And I sat in that wooden chair while the room emptied and thought about my sister asking me who'd believe me anyway under oath with the truth and a technician's signature across a seal. Everyone. Colleen, that's the entire point of the building. She took a plea in February to felony, leaving the scene of an accident involving serious injury, 60 snorts in days in the county jail. 3 years of probation, restitution, license and suspended for a year. She withdrew from the race in a statement that ran 90 seconds and thanked her supporters. Dale Whitfield is under investigation by the state bar for his conduct in the preparation of a statement for an unrepresented party, and he has not written to me, and I don't expect him to. Rex Calder announced in April that he would not seek another term and joined a firm in the capital that does municipal bond work. My parents were not charged. Ellery looked at it hard and told Renee the truth, proving what my mother did with a set of keys in her own house passed. A jury was not a case he could win. I want to be honest about how that sat. It sat badly for about a month. Then it stopped. A courtroom is a narrow instrument, and it was never going to give me what I actually needed. And by spring, I understood that what I actually needed had already happened in a doorway above a pharmacy. The party organization slotted a county supervisor into my sister's spot by March, and he is pulling fine. My father still has his table at the Legion breakfast. Nothing was cleansed. That's not what happens. Walter Boone went back to the Blue Star in December, 4 hours a day, 3 days a week on a stool they bolted down for him next to the flat top. The civil side settled with the insurer in the spring. It isn't enough, and it's more than he'd have gotten. And he bought the transmission, and then he bought Sharon a greenhouse. I stop in whenever I'm in the county on paperwork, which I still am. And he lets me buy a coffee, and then he charges me for the pie. Howard Lynn closed my ethics file in March with a tool-in memo. Judge was a fact witness in a family matter. No use of no violation. And on the shelf in my chambers, behind the desk where most judges put a photograph of their family, there is now a picture of an old man in an apron standing outside a diner with one hand on a cane and the other on my shoulder. In May, Emma texted me. She wrote, "Mom says I'm not supposed to text you, but nobody will tell me what actually happened." I typed for a long time. Then I told her the truth, all of it in the plainest language a 13-year-old could carry. And I did not make either of her parents a monster, and I did not make them innocent. She wrote back, "Thank you for saying it straight. Nobody ever says it straight. There's one more thing, and it's small, and it's the reason I'm telling you any of this." In June, a new clerk started in my chambers, 24 years old, nervous, very serious about the coffee. And on her second week, in the middle of nothing, she asked me whether I had family nearby. A year ago, I would have said no and let it go by the way I let everything go by for 14 years, and she would have written me down as private and been right. Instead, I heard myself say it out loud. The entire true sentence. No, my family's 6 hours away, and we're not in contact, and it's because my sister injured a man with my car, and my parents asked me to take the charge and I testified. She didn't know where to put her face. I told her it was all right, that people mostly don't know what to say, and they don't have to. Then we went back to the motion calendar. My mother was right about one thing, and I've decided to let her keep it. Families do run on stories. That part is true, but I'm done telling versions. If your family only loves the version of you that stays convenient, that was never love. And the day you stop auditioning for it is the day the rest of your life is finally allowed to start. That's my story. One empty key bowl, one sealed evidence bag, and one signature I never gave. If there's someone in your life who has you filed away as the family failure, hear me. You do not owe anybody a smaller version of yourself. Not at Thanksgiving, not ever. If this one stayed with you, send it to somebody who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.